Picture this. You are standing in the gilded corridors of a 17th century palace, where every breath tastes of incense and candle wax. The polished marble floors reflect the torchlight like shallow pools, and your ears echo with the distant shuffle of servants who scurry like shadows, careful never to meet your eye. The air is thick with power, gossip, and fear. You are not just in any royal court. You are in the palace of a queen whose reputation was whispered about in terrified tones, a queen who turned her authority inward, not just to rule over her people, but to rule over the most private bodies in her household. Her name was Christina of Sweden. To her subjects, she was eccentric, brilliant, and shockingly unconventional. But behind closed doors, she was something else entirely. A ruler who bent every rule of propriety. A woman who saw her servants not as attendants, but as unwilling participants in her restless desires. This is the story of a monarch whose power extended beyond politics, beyond religion, and even beyond morality. A queen who forced her servants into her bed. But before we dive into these hidden truths of history, let me pause. If you enjoy exploring the forbidden stories that history books rarely tell, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And comment below. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? I'm always amazed that these ancient tales reach ears across the world, binding us together across time and distance. Now, back to the palace. Christina of Sweden was no ordinary queen. Born in 1626 to King Gustavus Adolphus, the warrior king who led Sweden into the 30 Years' War, she inherited not just a crown but a destiny weighed down with blood and expectation. From the moment of her birth, she was different. Midwives whispered that she had been born with features too coarse for a girl. Her cries more like a battle shout than the wail of an infant. In fact, some courtiers believed she had been born a boy. So desperate was the court for a male heir. Instead, Sweden received a daughter, one who would grow into a ruler unlike any other Europe had ever seen. Raised as if she were a prince, Christina studied philosophy, politics, and the classics. She fenced, hunted, and debated with scholars, while other noble girls were taught embroidery. Yet, for all her brilliance, Christina had little interest in the duties expected of a woman, let alone a queen. She refused to marry, scoffed at courtly romance, and reveled in her independence. But her passions had to find release somewhere, and that release often came at the expense of those closest to her, her attendants, her ladies-in-waiting, and the vulnerable young servants who had no power to resist her whims. The palace was a paradox. In public, Christina cultivated the image of a philosopher, a patron of the arts who invited Descartes himself to her court. But in the silence of night, when the corridors were hushed and only the crackle of the hearth filled the air, rumors told of a queen who demanded the company of her servants in ways that blurred the line between command and violation. Witnesses wrote of Christina's unpredictable temper, how she would shower a servant with affection one day, only to berate and threaten them the next. But when it came to the privacy of her bedchamber, those same servants whispered of a queen who treated refusal as an impossibility. You can imagine the terror of being called into the royal chamber, the heavy curtains pulled shut, tapestries muffling sound, the flicker of candles throwing shadows against gilded walls. A young maid, barely in her teens, summoned to adjust the queen's gown, or bring a goblet of wine, only to find herself trapped beneath Christina's commanding gaze. For Christina, the crown meant absolute power, even over intimacy. And in the silence of her rooms, power became a weapon. But Christina's desires were not a secret. They echoed through the corridors of Stockholm, whispered by nobles and foreign ambassadors alike. Diplomatic letters describe her unwomanly affections, her habit of embracing her female companions in ways that scandalized visiting envoys. The French court mocked her openly, while the Vatican received troubling reports of her behavior. And yet, none dared confront her directly, for Christina was not just a woman, she was a queen, a monarch who commanded armies and negotiated treaties. Her reign was marked by contradictions. On one hand, she elevated Sweden's prestige by turning her court into a glittering center of European culture. On the other, her refusal to marry and her unruly passions fueled endless rumors. For her servants, however, this was no rumor, it was a daily reality. Their lives were not their own. To serve Christina meant surrendering more than labor. It meant yielding their very bodies. Imagine the weight of that silence. A servant dismissed in shame, unable to speak of what had transpired, for who would dare accuse a queen? To do so meant not just disgrace, but exile, perhaps even death. And so the whispers never rose above a murmur, carried from chambermaid to chambermaid, from page to page, until they became a legend of fear wrapped around Christina's name. But Christina's story did not end there. The same force that drove her to dominate her servants also drove her to make one of the most shocking decisions in European history. A choice that stunned her subjects, outraged the church, and reshaped her legacy forever. And that is where our story turns next. The whispers grew louder. By the time Christina reached her 20s, her servants no longer merely feared her temper, they feared her presence. The Palace of Stockholm, with its marble halls and vaulted ceilings, had become a theatre of intimidation where every attendant performed their role under the Queen's relentless scrutiny. To serve Christina meant living in constant uncertainty. One night she might embrace a servant with startling tenderness. The next, she could humiliate them in front of the entire household. Yet what bound them all was the knowledge that when Christina summoned, refusal was unthinkable. Those closest to her spoke of her volatile moods, how she alternated between scholarly brilliance and reckless indulgence. At dawn, she might be debating metaphysics with the greatest thinkers of Europe. By dusk, she might be demanding the company of a trembling maid, her voice sharp with command. In her world, power and desire were inseparable. Foreign diplomats began to take notice. Letters smuggled from Stockholm described the Queen's unorthodox appetites. Her fondness for draping herself over her ladies-in-waiting in ways that scandalized conservative observers. Some dismissed these reports as exaggerations born of misogyny. But for the servants inside her chamber, they were no exaggeration at all. The Queen's hands were restless, her demands unrelenting. Imagine being a young attendant, chosen from a noble family eager to curry favor with the crown. Your mother warns you, serve loyally, endure her moods, and your family may prosper. Yet the first night in her bedchamber, you discover what loyalty truly costs. The Queen's gaze falls on you not as a subject, but as prey. The heavy doors close, the tapestries absorb the sound, and suddenly the most powerful woman in Europe is leaning too close, her fingers brushing against yours, her whispers leaving no room for refusal. Christina's desire for domination was not limited to women. There are accounts, hushed but persistent, of young male pages who too found themselves trapped in her unpredictable orbit. She was a queen who rejected the boundaries of gender and convention, claiming for herself the same freedoms long indulged by kings. Yet while male monarchs were praised for their conquests, Christina's were condemned, hidden in shadows, recorded only in fragments of scandal. And yet, she did not care. Christina relished her defiance. She delighted in dressing in men's clothing, striding through her palace with boots and a sword, mocking the courtiers who muttered behind her back. Her rejection of marriage was itself a scandal. To her counselors, the absence of an heir was a national crisis. To Christina, it was liberation. Why should she shackle herself to a man when she already commanded the crown? But this defiance carried consequences. The nobility grew restless. The church grew suspicious. And within the palace walls, servants bore the brunt of her insatiable contradictions. To the world, she was eccentric. To those in her chamber, she was terrifyingly unpredictable. It is here that Christina's story takes a darker turn. As her reign wore on, her demands became more forceful. Servants whispered that her temper worsened after nights of rejection, that she lashed out at those who resisted her advances. A maid might find herself suddenly dismissed, her family disgraced, simply for hesitating at the wrong moment. A page might vanish from court entirely, his fate swallowed by rumor. The queen's fixation on control extended into elaborate rituals. She surrounded herself with an inner circle of favored attendants, women whose beauty and obedience she flaunted openly. She kissed them in public, embraced them at banquets, shocking visiting dignitaries. But behind closed doors, these same women endured the suffocating weight of Christina's need for dominance. One name appears again and again in the accounts: Iba Spar, her closest companion, a noblewoman whose beauty was legendary and whose bond with the queen scandalized all of Europe. Christina called her belle, wrote her letters filled with passion, and paraded her before the court as if daring anyone to speak against it. To some, their intimacy was proof of a love affair. To others, it was yet another example of Christina using her position to blur the line between affection and command. For Iba, the line was perilously thin. But Christina was not merely a woman of passion, she was a queen of contradictions. In the same year, she scandalized her court with her behavior. She shocked all of Christendom with a decision no one could have predicted. She renounced her throne. In 1654, at just 28 years old, Christina stunned Europe by abdicating the Swedish crown. Her reasons were cloaked in mystery: exhaustion, a desire for freedom, disillusionment with power. But some whispered that her private life, her defiance of expectation, had made her position untenable. The nobles demanded stability, the church demanded morality, and Christina could give them neither. Her abdication was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of an even stranger chapter. For where she went next, and what she did after casting off her crown, revealed just how far she was willing to push the boundaries of convention, and how deeply her hunger for control followed her, even without a throne. Because abdication freed her of Sweden's judgment, but not of her own desires. And in Rome, in the heart of Catholic Christendom, she would find new stages for her power, and new victims for her bed. The crown was gone. On June 6, 1654, Christina of Sweden shocked Europe by walking away from her throne. In the great hall of Uppsala Castle, before nobles, clergy, and courtiers, she shed her royal regalia piece by piece. The scepter, the crown, the robe, all surrendered with almost theatrical relish. She declared she was weary of rule, weary of expectation, weary of a life chained to duty. But the truth was far more complicated. In that moment, Sweden lost its queen. But Christina did not lose her hunger. After abdication, she left Sweden disguised in men's clothing, riding hard through Europe with a small entourage. She cut her hair, wore a sword, and demanded to be addressed not as a fallen queen, but as a sovereign in exile. Wherever she went, she created fascination and scandal. In Hamburg, in Antwerp, in Paris, nobles whispered about her behavior. She flirted openly with women, debated philosophers into the night, and unnerved kings with her defiance. To some, she was a curiosity, to others, a threat. And then she did something even more shocking. She converted to Catholicism. In 1655, Christina arrived in Rome, the very heart of Catholic Europe, where the Vatican received her with awe. A queen who had abandoned Protestant Sweden for the embrace of Rome was a political prize beyond imagining. She was celebrated in processions, serenaded with music, hailed as a miracle of conversion. Cardinals, artists, and princes gathered at her feet. But beneath the incense and ceremony, Christina's private life was as chaotic as ever. The palaces of Rome became her new hunting ground. She surrounded herself with a court of musicians, scholars, and servants, and just as in Stockholm, those closest to her bore the weight of her desires. The pattern repeated: public brilliance, private coercion, a servant summoned in the dead of night, trembling before her unpredictable moods, a lady in waiting lured by the promise of favor, only to discover there was no safe way to refuse the queen's intimacy. Roman society was both fascinated and horrified. Here was a woman who walked the streets in men's attire, who carried herself with the arrogance of a king, who spoke of love as if it were a battlefield. The rumors of her bedchamber tyranny, as some envoys called it, traveled quickly through the city. Whispers spread that her servants were not free, that her attendants were chosen not merely for loyalty, but for pliability. And yet, she remained untouchable. Christina was no longer a reigning queen, but she wielded her notoriety like a weapon. To her critics, she was a fallen monarch turned libertine. To her admirers, she was a symbol of freedom, a woman who refused to bend to any authority but her own. One figure in Rome became central to her new life, Cardinal Decio. He was said to be her confidant, perhaps even her lover, though accounts differ. What is certain is that he became her protector. With his influence, Christina secured a residence in the Palazzo Farnese, one of Rome's most splendid palaces. There, behind gilded doors, her household grew, and with it, the same dark reputation. Servants whispered of nights when the queen's laughter echoed through the halls, followed by muffled sobs that suggested not all were willing participants in her revelries. Diplomats recorded her affairs in coded language, careful not to provoke scandal in writing, but unable to resist noting her excessive affections for her attendants. Christina herself did not hide it. In her letters, she wrote boldly of passion, of hunger, of the need to possess those she desired. She compared love to conquest, and her words revealed a woman who saw intimacy as a continuation of power. In one surviving note, she declared, "I do not yield, I command. And where I command, love must obey. But power is a dangerous drug." The longer Christina lived in Rome, the more reckless she became. She flaunted her relationships, paraded her favorites before the city, and dared the Vatican to censure her. She mocked marriage, derided propriety, and dismissed the boundaries that restrained other women. Yet, her servants had no such freedom. For them, her bed was not an invitation, it was an order. The contradictions of Christina's life deepened. She patronized great artists like Gian Lorenzo Bernini, commissioning works that celebrated beauty and devotion. She hosted salons where philosophers debated the nature of virtue. And yet, behind those same palace walls, she blurred the line between passion and coercion in ways that left scars on those forced into her orbit. It was during this time that her name became legend, both feared and celebrated. She was the Minerva of the North, the scholar queen, the philosopher in exile. But among her household, she was something far more intimate and far more terrifying. For while the world saw her as a woman who abandoned her throne for freedom, her servants knew the truth. Christina never abandoned power. She simply shifted its stage, using her chamber as her throne room and her attendants as unwilling subjects. And soon, her private excesses would spill into public violence. When Christina's hunger for control turned deadly, leaving Europe stunned and her reputation stained forever. Rome adored her and feared her. Christina of Sweden, the abdicated queen who had traded a crown for freedom, had become one of the most dazzling, yet unpredictable, figures in Europe. Cardinals entertained her, artists immortalized her, philosophers debated under her roof. But beneath the glittering surface of her salons and spectacles, the same restless energy that had driven her from Stockholm simmered like a hidden fire. Her servants still bore the weight of her whims, her ladies still endured her insistent demands, and soon that hunger for control would cross a line so shocking that even Rome could not ignore it. The story begins in her household at the Palazzo Ri, where Christina surrounded herself with an entourage of scholars, musicians, and personal attendants. Among them was Marchese Gian Rinaldo Monaldeschi, her master of the horse, a man entrusted with her most private affairs, from handling her finances to arranging her secret liaisons. To outsiders, he was her loyal servant, but inside the palace walls, he lived under the same suffocating pressure as all who fell into Christina's orbit. He knew her moods, her appetites, her unpredictability, and he knew the danger of disappointing her. In the autumn of 1657, Christina summoned her court to Fontainebleau in France, where she had taken residence for a time. The corridors of that French palace were no less intimidating than those in Rome. Servants hurried at her command. Musicians played until their fingers ached, and courtiers danced attendance on a queen without a kingdom. But beneath the pageantry, a storm was gathering. Christina had discovered what she believed to be a betrayal. Letters, intercepted and read aloud, suggested that Monaldeschi had been corresponding with her enemies, perhaps even exposing the secrets of her private life. To Christina, this was more than treachery. It was humiliation. Betrayal was the one wound she could not endure, for it threatened the illusion of control on which her entire existence depended. Imagine the scene. The great gallery of Fontainebleau, its walls lined with mirrors and gilt, echoing with the shuffle of uneasy courtiers. Christina sits in her chair, not as a guest in France, but as though she was still sovereign of Sweden. Before her kneels Monaldeschi, trembling as letters are read aloud, their contents damning, their authenticity uncertain. Around them stand the servants, some who had whispered their own fears of her bed, now forced to watch as her wrath found a new victim. Then, with terrifying calm, Christina gave the order. Monaldeschi was to be executed, not tried, not imprisoned, but killed. Here and now, under her authority, her guards hesitated, stunned. To kill a man inside the French king's palace was madness, but Christina's voice carried the weight of a queen who had never learned to be refused. The sword was drawn. The first blow fell clumsily, slashing Monaldeschi across the face. He screamed, stumbling, pleading for mercy. The second struck deeper, staining the marble floor with blood. For nearly an hour, the executioners hacked and stabbed, their incompetence prolonging the horror, while Christina watched in silence. Some accounts say she paced, her face cold with fury. Others claim she leaned forward, commanding each strike, her eyes fixed on the man she believed had betrayed her. By the time Monaldeschi lay lifeless, the court was in chaos. Servants wept, courtiers whispered in terror, and even Christina's closest attendants felt the chill of dread. If a nobleman of high rank could be butchered on her command, what hope did a mere maid or page have to resist her will? The queen who forced her servants into her bed had now proven she could force death upon anyone who crossed her. The scandal was immediate. France was outraged. Killing within the king's palace was an insult to Louis XIV himself. Diplomats called it barbaric. Pamphlets circulated accusing Christina of madness, cruelty, even demonic possession. Yet, astonishingly, she was not punished. Louis, ever pragmatic, allowed her to leave France quietly. Perhaps he feared what secrets she carried. Perhaps he wished to avoid further scandal. Christina slipped back to Rome, her reputation forever stained. But for her household, the lesson was clear. Their queen's authority had no limits. If she could order the death of a nobleman in the heart of France, what protection did a servant have when summoned to her chamber in the dead of night? To resist her advances was unthinkable. To whisper against her was fatal. She had turned her power into terror, and those closest to her lived in silence, their lives overshadowed by the possibility of her wrath. Yet even after this act of blood, Christina's story did not end. Rome welcomed her back, not as a disgraced exile, but as a curiosity too valuable to condemn. The Vatican tolerated her, artists adored her, and her court once again glittered with spectacle. But her servants still whispered. They still feared the knock at midnight, the heavy door closing, the queen's hand reaching where no refusal was possible. And as she grew older, her eccentricities deepened. Her desires became more erratic, and her reputation transformed into something both legendary and monstrous. Because while Christina had abandoned her throne, she had never abandoned her need for conquest. And in the twilight of her life, the queen who forced her servants into her bed would leave behind a legacy so tangled in scandal that centuries later, we are still unraveling its truths. The years passed, but Christina never softened. In Rome, her household continued to swell, a strange mixture of scholars, artists, musicians, and the ever-present servants who carried the weight of her moods. Time did not tame her. It only sharpened her contradictions. She was a woman without a throne, yet still carried herself as if she ruled all of Europe. At public gatherings, she dazzled with wit, philosophy, and laughter. Behind closed doors, the same shadow of fear stretched across her attendants' lives. Her palace became a paradox, a place of brilliance and terror. Candles flickered through salons where Jesuits debated theology one moment, only for hushed cries to echo in the bedchambers the next. Christina's reputation for forcing her servants into her intimacy was no longer just whispered in Stockholm. It was part of her legend in Rome, and yet she faced no true consequences. Too many were enthralled by her charisma, too many dazzled by her defiance. Her eccentricities deepened with age. Christina insisted on being treated like a man in formal settings, often dressing in doublets and boots, her sword clattering against marble floors as she strode through the Vatican halls. She mocked the customs of women, scorning embroidery and courtly graces. Instead, she reveled in contradiction, a queen who was neither king nor woman in the traditional sense, but something in between, something untamed. For her servants, this eccentricity was not charming. It was dangerous. A maid might be summoned in the middle of the night, only to discover the queen in one of her restless moods. A page might be called to read aloud from a book, only to be trapped by the queen's piercing gaze, his words faltering under the weight of her closeness. There was no safety in proximity. Those who pleased her were elevated, showered with affection and gifts. Those who resisted or hesitated risked dismissal, disgrace, or worse. Even in her 50s, Christina's hunger did not fade. Foreign envoys recorded with astonishment her continued devotion to her ladies-in-waiting, her habit of embracing and kissing them openly. Some believed her relationships had mellowed into companionship. Others whispered that her need for dominance had not dimmed, that the queen who once commanded armies still commanded bodies, demanding the obedience of her servants long after her crown was gone. And yet, there was a vulnerability beneath her bravado. Christina was acutely aware of her legacy. She wrote letters filled with both pride and bitterness, railing against those who judged her, mocking the small-mindedness of her critics. She declared herself above the morality of her age, insisting that history would remember her brilliance rather than her scandal. But her servants, whose names history has forgotten, carried a different memory, of nights they could not refuse, of a queen whose power invaded even the sanctuary of their own bodies. Rome, for its part, continued to indulge her. Popes came and went, yet Christina was always welcome at the Vatican, always honored in public processions. Artists painted her portrait, scholars praised her intellect, and travelers marveled at the sight of the eccentric northern queen who had made Rome her home. But within the walls of her palazzo, the servants still whispered, still trembled when her voice called their name. As age pressed on her body, Christina turned her mind more and more to eternity. She grew obsessed with how she would be remembered, commissioning writings and attempting to shape her image as a philosopher queen, a patron of the arts, a defiant woman who lived by her own rules. But even here, her contradictions showed. For while she dreamed of leaving behind the legacy of a sage, she could not escape the habits that had defined her life. Servants still came and went, some mysteriously dismissed, others elevated beyond their station, all bound by the same silence that had protected her secrets for decades. And then, as her health began to decline in the final years of the 1680s, Christina's palace grew quieter. The salons dimmed, the debates faded, and the once restless queen spent more time alone with her most trusted attendants. But those who were closest to her at the end of her life would discover that even in her weakness, Christina's demands did not soften. The same power she had wielded in her youth still lingered in her eyes, in her voice, in the simple act of summoning a servant to her chamber. Because for Christina, power was not something a crown gave her. It was something she believed she carried in her very being. And even as death drew near, she would not surrender it. But what happened in those final days, and how Rome chose to honor a queen whose private life was filled with such scandal, reveals just how far Christina's legend had outgrown the truth. By the late 1680s, Christina's once restless body began to betray her. The queen who had ridden across Europe disguised as a man, who had debated scholars until dawn and commanded her attendants with ruthless intensity, now spent long hours confined within her Roman palace. Illness crept over her with relentless patience. Fevers, swelling, weakness in her limbs. Physicians came and went, offering tonics and prayers, but nothing could restore the fierce vitality that had carried her through a life of scandal and defiance. Yet, even in her decline, Christina remained Christina. Her servants still felt the weight of her summons, her gaze, her unyielding expectations. To attend to her sick bed was not simply an act of duty. It was to endure her moods, her sudden demands, her refusal to accept that her power was slipping away. A maid might be ordered to sit at her bedside through the night, forbidden to sleep, forced to respond to the queen's restless chatter. A page might be commanded to read aloud until his voice cracked, only for Christina to wave him away in irritation. Even in frailty, she would not surrender control. But for those closest to her, the experience was more complicated still. Some whispered that as her strength waned, her affections became needier, more desperate. She clung to her attendants in moments of weakness, her hands grasping, her voice insistent. The queen, who had once dominated with fire, now sought comfort with a feverish intensity, but still in ways that blurred the line between care and coercion. Her servants, bound by loyalty and fear, remained silent. Rome watched with fascination as the eccentric queen of the north approached her end. She had long been a curiosity, a woman who had traded a crown for freedom, who had defied gender, who had lived as though the world's rules did not apply to her. Now, the question lingered. How would she die? Would she repent, confess, seek forgiveness for a life that had scandalized Christendom? Or would she meet death as she had lived, on her own terms, unyielding to any authority but her own? In April of 1689, the end came. Christina died at the age of 62. Her final breath exhaled in the rooms where so many had served her in silence. For her attendants, it was the closing of a chapter that had bound their lives to hers, sometimes in ways they dared not speak. For Rome, it was the passing of a legend. And here lies the irony. The Vatican, fully aware of her scandals, nonetheless chose to honor her in death in a way reserved for the holiest of rulers. Christina of Sweden was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, the very heart of Catholicism, one of only 3 women to ever be granted such an honor. The city that had tolerated her eccentricities now enshrined her among popes and saints. The funeral was a spectacle. Cardinals in crimson, choirs filling the basilica with sacred hymns, nobles in mourning black. Rome celebrated her as a philosopher queen, a patron of the arts, a convert who had abandoned Protestant heresy for the true faith. The official eulogies spoke of her brilliance, her courage, her devotion. Not a word was said of her servants, not a whisper of the nights behind closed doors, not a syllable of the coercion that had shaped so many lives. History, it seemed, had chosen which Christina it wished to remember: the philosopher, the defiant woman, the queen who had given up a throne for freedom. But in the silence of the Vatican's marble crypts, another Christina remained, the one her servants had known, the one whose bedchamber was a place of fear as much as intimacy, whose power reached into the most private corners of human dignity. Even in death, the contradiction endured. She was celebrated as both saint and scandal, philosopher and predator, liberator and tyrant. To some, she was a symbol of a woman who refused to be bound by her gender, who carved her own path in a world ruled by men. To others, She was a reminder that power, unchecked, can corrupt even the most brilliant minds. And so, Christina's legacy became a puzzle. Which story would survive? The one told in marble and hymns, or the one whispered by forgotten servants whose voices never made it into the history books? Yet Christina herself might not have cared, for her reputation was just another battlefield, another conquest. She had lived her life without apology, without fear, without surrender, and perhaps, as she lay beneath the dome of St. Peter's, she believed she had won. But had she? Because while Rome honored her with pomp and glory, the darker truth of her private life still lurked beneath the surface, waiting for those who dared to look closer. Centuries have passed since Christina of Sweden walked the halls of her Roman palaces, yet her shadow still lingers. Historians celebrate her as a patron of the arts, a philosopher, a rebel who defied the strictures of her age. Feminists hail her as a woman who refused to bend to marriage, who claimed authority over her life in a world ruled by men. The Vatican still honors her among its chosen few, her tomb resting under the great dome of St. Peter's. But there is another Christina, one who rarely makes it into the polished biographies or official histories. The Christina remembered not by cardinals or kings, but by the nameless attendants who lived under her rule, the maids who trembled when summoned, the pages who could not refuse, the companions whose intimacy was never entirely their own. Their voices have been lost to time, buried beneath centuries of silence. Yet their absence speaks loudly, a reminder that history often chooses which truths to preserve and which to forget. Think of it. A queen who forced her servants into her bed was honored as if she were a saint. A woman whose power reached not only into politics, but into the most private lives of her household was celebrated with hymns and marble. The contradiction is almost unbearable, yet it is also the essence of history. It is not a neat record of virtue and vice, but a tangled knot of glory and shame, light and shadow. Christina herself would have relished this. She loved to shock, to scandalize, to defy expectation. She once declared that she belonged to no one, that she would not be caged by the world's rules. In that sense, she succeeded. Even now, she cannot be neatly categorized. Was she a visionary or a tyrant? A pioneer of female independence? Or a predator who abused her power? The answer lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. And perhaps that is why her story still grips us. Because Christina forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that brilliance and cruelty can live within the same person. That the same hand that patronized artists could also command servants into submission. That power, no matter who wields it, carries the temptation to overstep, to consume, to destroy. As you sit with this story, imagine yourself once more in those gilded corridors. The candles flicker, the marble floor echoes. A servant is called into the queen's chamber, the door closing with a heavy thud. Outside, Rome sings of Christina, the philosopher queen, the convert, the eccentric. Inside, another truth unfolds in silence, one that will never make it to the grand eulogies, but which lingers in the whispered memories of those who served her. That silence is the real legacy of Christina of Sweden. Not the crowns she wore, not the throne she abandoned, not even the marble tomb in St. Peter's, but the silence of her servants, carried across centuries, telling us that power has a private cost we rarely acknowledge. And so, the queen who forced her servants into her bed remains a figure of fascination, not just for what she achieved, but for what she revealed. That history is not just kings and queens, victories and treaties, but also the intimate struggles of those who lived in their shadows. Because sometimes, the most haunting stories are not the ones carved in stone, but the ones whispered, trembling in the dark.